Welcome to the Storied Podcast. I'm your host, Chaz Becker, and with me, as always, is Jesse Ojeda, my co host. And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the problem with wanting control. The reason I wanted to kind of bring up this topic was I think control is an interesting thing that we all struggle with, that we all want. Control is a thing that we all need in certain aspects of our life. And even as we were talking about this, we were trying to figure out the title. And so we're going to dive into that more. But yeah, I'm just excited to talk about the topic of control because we all need it. We all want it. There's good, there's bad. And so diving into it. But Jesse, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing good. I think it's it's very funny that I think maybe even the way that we were talking about the title of the podcast was both of us figuring out our sense of control in there. So implicitly, this is something that's just so baked into our everyday lives, right? And how especially some of our personalities are really wired towards wanting control. Whether we want control for safety, we want control to preserve our value, we want control for security of some sorts. There's so many underlying motivations for why we vie for control, and a God that we have that's consistently asking us to give that over to Him. So it'll be a ripe conversation, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to diving in with you, Chaz.
Yeah. So to start, it was like we just to bring you guys into the conversation we're having before the conversation was do we title this the problem with wanting control or the problem with needing control? And as we were kind of diving into that, it's like needing control is like always kind of a problem. Like if you need it, like that's obviously a problem. But then I think the more interesting question, this is where Jesse was kind of leading us, is like, at what point is wanting control like going from like a healthy want to an unhealthy wanting of control? And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if we're gonna get to that answer in this
We're
episode.
gonna try, but yeah,
But
we'll see.
we're gonna talk about it and we'll see what happens. So yeah, I don't know. Like, what are your initial thoughts about just the need and want for control in our lives?
Yeah, I think, just to even bring it back to the discussion, like we don't need to convince the listeners that needing control is a problem. I think they know that. But to what degree does wanting become an issue? And I think the answer, at least for me, lies in what is motivating the need for control or the desire for control, right? Is it because you feel that you are the only one who can do something correctly? Do you think that you need to do this if it's going to be done well? The reason I want control so much is because I believe that um, I can't trust others to do the work for me. Do we desire control so much because we feel that if we don't have that control, that we sacrifice a significant need for certainty that we need? That I can be certain if I have control because I know what I have in my purview, what is in my ability, and what isn't my ability. And releasing that control means I don't know that, and that lack of security, and that lack of certainty is something that inspires a deep anxiety in me. On a positive side, sometimes control can just be a sense of, well, I desire to take this into my power because I know that there are some strengths here that I can really live out. I know that there are some giftings here that I want to do. Not that I feel like if I don't get to do them, that that's going to affect who I am or who those gifts are. But I want to step into doing that, which I would maybe even argue isn't necessarily control at its core, but certainly is a way of taking agency and taking steps forward in that way. Um, and I think finding where some of those internal motivations are can point to whether that is a problematic sense of control or not. Because in the first few examples I shared, really what control is, it's a route to If we wanted to talk spiritually, maybe a lack of trust of what the Lord could be doing in a certain circumstance, and actually like a lack of trust of a potential growth point for us of being able to hand over aspects of our lives to Him. And I think from a more psychological or maybe more secular perspective, to not use the kind of Christianese language, an inability to trust others, an inability to, uh, you know, uh, find a sense of where our limits are in relationship to others, which can still be helpful. Maybe an inability to deal with uncertainty that over time can inspire a lot of anxious thoughts and anxious feelings in our life because life is uncertain. We don't have control over our lives. I think the American context, as we've talked about, has tried to convince us that we can, has tried to convince us that we can construct our lives in whatever sort of certainty, whatever sort of ability we can. But there are so many things that are outside of our control. And it's a reality that we have to live alongside that. The inability to uh, recognize that as something that is a reality of life will inspire deep uh, anxiety within ourselves. And I think that when the motivation for control is something that's actually serving a deeper longing, a deeper desire that may be pushing us in a way to not come to terms with some of the realities of the life that we live, whether we arrive at those spiritually or arrive at those psychologically. I think that, at least for me, is how I'm able to determine, especially in my own life, and have certainly throughout the years determined in my own life. Why do I feel I need to control this so much? Why do I feel that I need control in this area? But I'm curious for Chaz, how about you? How have you noticed that in your life come up?
Yeah. Even as you were sharing, I was like, oh, this is why I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah.
Like just something like just really came up in my mind, and it comes to my like day job. Um
Yeah.
the outcomes of my job are so much out of my control. There's so many factors outside of my control in my day-to-day work, and um that lack of control for me has come to a point where it's like now unhealthy. Like I need to have a little more control of
Yeah.
my performance. Um and law and then it's also connected to like the thing that I do all day every day. Like I'm not using my strengths, right? So it's like I
Mm,
don't have control to like do what I do best, and I don't have a ton of control in like the outcome of the efforts that I'm actually doing. And so
yeah.
putting those together, I'm like, okay, like I need to make a switch, which I have some level of control of like pursuing a change. And then there's a lot of things outside of that it's like, okay, will I get a job in the time frame that I want? Da, 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 da. Like all of those things are so far outside of my control. But I'm looking at the things that I can control that are going to lead me to I think, a better place flourishing. And then I'm giving over the rest to Jesus and figuring that out with him. Um, and so I think the reason this topic was coming up in my mind was just navigating like how much of this control is good and bad and
Yeah.
figuring that out, right? And I think a lot of times we're like, especially in Christian circles, the idea of like any control is bad. Like it's like you got to give everything over to Jesus in terms of like him controlling it. And I understand that like sliver of truth, but like he's also given us the autonomy and the ability to walk with him in being determinant on the type of control that we have
Yeah.
as his created beings, and navigating that and kind of coming into this conversation in a place of like, in my work life, I don't have the amount of control that maybe I need to like thrive. And so now I'm stepping into like working with God and trusting him in this move for like a better fit for that, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Did that make sense? Because I'm like, honestly,
Yeah.
like
I
as you
think
were
so.
talking, that kind of all popped up into my head at once on this topic. And so I think your question to me was like, how do you determine like how much control is like the right amount? And, when does wanting become unhealthy? And I think the question is like, what what are you trying to control? And is this something that God like kind of has ordained you to have control over? Right?
Mm,
Like, is like,
yeah.
are you trying to control things that are uncontrollable? Or are you like controlling things that are like under your purview and your responsibility to like have some authority over in your life?
Yeah.
And figuring that out. Like, I think if you're like, I want to control my whole life so that I avoid all suffering and I don't experience like pain or grief, or like any type of negative emotions, like, well, you're trying to control way too much. Like, that's like way outside of the
Yeah.
scope of like what you're supposed to control. But if it's, how do I use my strengths on a day-to-day basis? And how do I make sure that I'm protecting and providing for my family? And thinking about ways that I'm going to do that as well as I can. I think that is a level of control that you have over, and you have the autonomy and the ability to step into. And so it's really asking like, yeah, are these things in the purview of what's like an appropriate level of
Yeah.
control of my life? Or am I trying to play the role of God? And
Yeah.
doing what only he can do. And so um that takes a lot of discernment. That takes walking with the
It does.
spirit and
It's not
listening to
easy. Yeah.
him to figure it out. And for a lot of people who don't have God, like, then they only have themselves. And so they have to try to control everything because they don't have someone they can trust to give that control over to. Um, and figuring that out. So yeah, I think that's my like first swing at the topic of control.
Yeah. I think something that came up for me while you were talking is it does take a lot of discernment for sure. I think one of the ways we can look to that discernment as Christians is what are the roles that God has called us to. And one of those roles is stewarding things well. Particularly you bring up as, as a father and um as someone who's helping marriage and helping develop your child, that there is a role that God has called you to be a provider and a protector and a servant to those individuals. If you're trying to control things to that end, to a degree, I'll say, but mostly in those things to an end in most cases, that's part of a God-given role that's been bestowed upon you. That God is inviting you to take agency in that. Now, when there becomes a lack of trust to trust yourself more than God in those situations is when we take role too far. But using some of those roles as a guidepost, I think especially as Christians and our responsibilities to our community members around us, to the marginalized and the oppressed, who are are suffering in this world, that God has called us to help see the image of God in them and help serve them. These are ways in which we can see, okay, God has established and stewarded us to have responsibility over things, and taking control to enact those responsibilities in most senses can be a guide of, okay, this is good. This is the right direction. How far am I taking it? Am I taking this into a way I'm no longer trusting those around me? Am I taking this in a way that I'm serving myself over others? I think the way we talk about it in psychology is control has a functional role in our lives. And the functional role is often in many ways not the way we tell ourselves it actually is there for. Sometimes we say we want to enact control because we think that, having control over something will allow us to fulfill this role that we're stepping into that God has given. But the function may be is that I get really nervous and anxious and untenable when I think about trusting something over to God. That's actually the function of control in our lives. The content we're saying is, oh, well, I'm stepping into this role that God has given me. But the function is, if I ever let go of this, I will become so anxious that I can not actually think of following God anymore. And that's an invitation that God may be saying, well, maybe that is something that I'm asking you to give a little bit more over and over to me so that we can establish that trust, whether it's with him, whether it's with other people in our lives. But I do think the roles are a good place to start. The ways that God has already kind of dictated to us as our role as followers of Christ in our families, in our communities, where we can step into some of that control. I think it's just realizing that functional role, I think, is something that I like to bring in from psychology and something that I like to say, because those internal motivators, those internal things that we're going after, validation, value, security, and safety, um, agency, the ability to do things on our own. If we are only serving those are the internal motivators beyond control. Those, I think, are telltale signs of, oh, this is actually serving something in me that is not forming me more into the person of Christ. This is actually forming me in more of the person of myself. And I think that is something that is hopefully a little bit of a marker that our listeners can use to determine what that can look like. And look, you do that through, I think, that the value of people speaking into your life who know you well, talking through this and in your own counseling journey, should you choose to explore that way. I found a lot of value through it in spiritual direction. I think if we are familiar, if our listeners are familiar with spiritual directors or beyond, kind of just pastoral care, but someone who's willing to kind of take the status and um, current stock of your life and sort of try and see where some of these affections and desires are pushing you towards and building some parts of your life over others. Spiritual direction has also been a way that I've really received some input into, oh, this is maintaining a part of my life that maybe is not super helpful to me right now. And maybe I need to be aware of the space that I'm giving it. Um, but yeah, again, some thoughts around the functional element, I think, can be a little bit of a telltale sign of how to help us discern something that is honestly difficult to do. It's difficult to discern the role that control plays in our lives, and when it crosses over into being something that is not as helpful in our lives as it could be.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were sharing there, I thought of idols in our life.
Mm. I almost
And
used that word. That was the word I was going
yeah,
to use. Yeah.
yeah, is and control, it can be a indicator of the things that we have idols that we put on the pedestal of God. Like, without this thing, I am nothing. Without this thing, like, I
Yeah.
can't continue on. The thought of losing control in this aspect of my life, like, leads me to questioning God himself. Um, and so is that the function? Is that what you're saying of control? I want to make sure I'm connecting that
Yeah.
language correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that function of control
Is to maintain the idol. Yeah.
is to maintain the idol. And so then it gives us an idea of, like, well, what are the idols in my life? And so then once we identify those, then we can take them to Jesus and be like, help me kill this thing. Like, help me
Yeah.
get rid of this. And when we're able to identify how control points to the idol, I think what that can help us do is then, like, have something that we can hand over to God. Cause it's really hard to, like, hand over the control, like, cause it is like this gray, like, area, but it's like, okay, like, my desire for control of this thing is the idol. The thing is the idol that I don't want to lose. And I'm trying to control the circumstances around that. And so now I can take this thing, give it over to Jesus, and, like, trust that the Spirit's going to do his work in transforming my heart to be able to give that over, let that die, and trust Jesus with whatever that is. And yeah, as I think about going back to, like, my job situation, in that context, like why I'm like, okay, like this is like a healthy need and desire for control versus not, is like my want for control doesn't lead me to this thing that I can't live without. Like it's like, oh, I can't keep going forward if like things don't change. Um and there may have been that, but I handed it over to Jesus as I'm continuing to verbally process it. And he led me to this place of like, yeah, like this isn't like the healthiest thing. If you are stuck in this job for the rest of your life, like you'll survive, you'll be good. Like I'm not questioning the Lord's
Yeah.
sovereignty and goodness in my life. Um, but at the same time, I'm like, but I like, there's a level of like thriving that I think God has for me and desires for me that's like leading me to take steps to like find a job where I'll have a little bit more control over my performance and security of my job, that I think would be really healthy for me. Um, and so you're like, it's like that's I think like using my own circumstances like a framework for how to think about this a little bit is like, yeah, like what do I want control over? Like, is that thing that I want control over something that's like going to lead me astray and not trust God? If it is, then like I need to take that thing to Jesus and like
Yeah.
let him crucify it and sanctify me. And then if it's not, then I'm going to ask him to like, Lord, help guide me and I'll do the things that I have control over and I'm going to trust you with the rest. Um and yeah, so then that goes into like, what are my responsibilities? How do I steward, you know, my gifts and talents and steward the things that I do have to move me in this direction? I'm going to trust the rest to God. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's like a good framework as you kind of try to diagnostic your need and want for control.
Yeah, something that was coming up for me as you're sharing that is just to encourage the audience because, gosh, we all want control so badly. We all do. And there's so many examples in the Bible of some of the major heroes of faith doing kind of really bad things to get control in their lives, and the Lord's still working through it. I think of, I know, Abram and Sarai and Hagar, and trying to go against the Lord's timing. I think of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. Just elements of where if I take agency, I take control over this, it's because I'm not trusting that the Lord is doing what he's doing. And while there are sometimes consequences to those, the Lord still provides through them. God meets Hagar and Ishmael out in the desert. Hagar is is the first, I believe, individual to name God by name in the Bible, because of her faithfulness to him, even despite the lack of control that is in her circumstance and what has been done through other people. God will still work through our desires for control. It's not something that's new to him. It's not something that he can't deal with. He's always going to invite us to give it over to him. And I think that is the challenge that we have to try and work closer and closer towards. But there has been so many elements of our lives that have been formed to maintain control, to keep pushing for control, and to believe the lie that we are the masters of our own fate and we are the best arbiters of our situation. Or the opposite of that, which is everyone else needs to be the arbiter of my fate and not me at all, because I don't have the thought process and ability to take any control. Because I think we're talking about this really on one spectrum of wanting so much control, but there's also an episode that we could talk about of giving control out to so many other people because we want to abdicate the roles and responsibilities that the Lord has given to us. I think that's an important consideration as well, to think of, all right, in what ways do I actually not want any control over this? Because I'm really nervous about my own ability to steward the outcome. That is in the same way not fully what God wants for us, because there are ways that God wants to have us step into the gifts that he's given us. He wouldn't give us the abilities to do what he does if he didn't have those roles for us. But there are some ways in which we need to build our own confidence and our own understanding of the value that we have and the giftings that we have that the Lord has given us to step into control in those ways that we are afraid to. The this is a conversation on the other side of the coin as well, right? Which I know me, knowing myself and Chaz, I know that's not necessarily the ways I think we are being actively formed. If anything, we're trying to let go of control, but there's going to be listeners who are trying to step more into that control because they so much so want to let go of it, and they haven't taken on the control in a really powerful way in their lives. And I don't want to leave them out, because I think this is as much of a conversation for them as well, to be
Yeah,
challenged to sometimes take on more control if that's a really hard thing for them to do.
totally. Yeah, that's so good. I think because I'm a control taker, like not even like it,
I'm a control
but
freak. Yeah. I'll say
yeah.
that easily.
So, no, I think that's such a good point. And there's people that I've worked with that, as I've been coaching them and things, fall into that camp of trying to abdicate control, um, that they should have. And one, they're really hard people for me to coach. I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
because it's so foreign to my brain. Um, but also like to see moments when they start like growing in that area, and how their walk with the Lord improves and their self-esteem grows, and you start seeing them walk in confidence that they didn't have before, is like so uplifting. And so if you're in that camp, like I encourage you to like start taking action on the things that you do have control over, and trust that the Lord hasn't made a mistake in the gifts that He's given you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, like that's where the trust for you is that like God has given you gifts and strengths and things that He wants you to edify His people and to steward His world with, and you have a part to play in the story. So um, I think with that we'll start wrapping up this conversation of control. Um, I thought it went better than I thought I was going to be honest. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. But yeah, love you guys. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon. Peace.
See you next time.